Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 56th Annual RTDNA Canada National Conference. I'm Ian Koningsvis, President of RTDNA Canada, and it gives me great pleasure to officially open this year's conference. We have two very exciting days ahead of us, filled with captivating content from a diverse group of very compelling storytellers. Our association could not exist without the tremendous support of the major networks in this country. Their involvement as partners, sponsors, and participants in our annual national conference and their ongoing commitment to the board and to our awards program is critical to the health of journalism in this country. The conference theme this year, Journalism and the Disruption of Truth, Connecting Audiences in the Age of Mistrust, is very important. It's telling our audiences that we report the facts or that we are truth tellers is no longer sufficient. This conference will explore the value of journalism in terms of both a business and a profession and how we can regain the public's trust. Audience trust and credibility will define our success or lead to our failure. Canadian journalists remain resolute and continue to adapt to a rapidly changing industry. To thrive, we need a steadfast commitment to protect the integrity and efficacy of our profession by news management and ownership. This partnership, we believe, will allow local journalism to continue to play its vital role in the Canadian democracy. I would like to thank our sponsors, special partner CBC News, platinum sponsor CTV News, our gold sponsors Rogers Media, City News and 680 News, CNN News Source, Ipsos Global Public Affairs, silver sponsors Accenture, Dentons, our bronze sponsors Global News, DeGiro, Getty Images and Google, our educator sponsor Globe Newswire, and our friend sponsors Chartbeat, Mac, and UCAP Radio. And thank you to the Canadian Press for sponsoring this session. I would like to thank our social media reporters from Ryerson and Humber, who will be expanding our social and digital footprint over the course of the next few days. Our AGM, where we'll elect a new board of an executive, takes place this afternoon at 3:45. A sincere thank you to everyone for coming out and supporting this association. And now, to help us reconnect with our audience in this age of mistrust, please welcome our our conference co-chairs, Fiona Conway and George Brown.
Thanks, Ian, and thank all of you for coming and supporting us in this great convention and conference. And I also wanted to welcome our out-of-town guests from New York, Washington, Florida, Ghana, Scarborough, and of course all across Canada. We have a terrific lineup of informative and provocative sessions planned for today and tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to go deeper into our craft. For this session and for the rest of the morning, we will explore the question of trust and how the public perceives us as the so-called purveyors of truth. And now over to my co-chair, Fiona.
Thank you, George. So to launch us off today, we are very pleased and I think privileged to have John Clinton, Edelman's chair. Edelman North American head of creative content is with us today. The Edelman Trust Barometer has been measuring trust in people and institutions around the world globally for 18 years. I'm not sure there's quite a body of work like this. And John presents this research globally, but he's here today. I think we're very fortunate to have him to give us some news on Canada specifically and some news for us on journalism and our trust barometer. So take it away, John.
Thank you, Fiona. I appreciate it. I was glad to see the new hip worked and I got up at this stage, no problem. I'm lucky enough to work for a private company. Edelman is the largest private communications company in the world, and so we still invest in things like IP. And we've been working on the Trust Barometer for 18 years. It's the largest study of trust in the world. We measure in 28 markets, 33,000 respondents. And we look at trust across NGOs, business, media, and government, and have measured those for all of those years. We look at two publics. We looked at the informed public, which is about 15%, represents about 15% of the global population, and we look at the general population, which represents about 85% of the population. The fundamental difference between the two is the informed public tends to be more media literate, higher educated, higher income. So what I wanted to do is, over the 18 years, we've seen many trends, but there are probably four that really stand out. It was first started in 2001, and that was the battle in Seattle. And that was where we saw the rise of NGOs as the most trusted institution in the world. And that was true in almost every country. I think China and India were the only two countries where that wasn't true. But everywhere else, NGOs had a huge lead in being a trusted institution. The second thing we saw is 2005, 2006, we saw the drop in trust in figures of authority and the rise in trust in people like me, people who were employees. So people that people could relate to more than experts. The third thing that we saw was that trust in the world is largely driven by economic prosperity, which makes people trust more, or economic disparity, which makes people trust less. And the last thing we saw was cataclysmic events have huge impacts on trust. So Fukushima in Japan, we saw the trust collapse in all institutions in Japan. 2008, 2009, the banking crisis saw trust in banking drop around the world, with the possible exception of Canada, to a point that it's just recovering now. So incredibly dramatic. Now this year, trust has really changed. So we have had a phenomenal change, and some would call what's going on in the US a cataclysmic event. I find it interesting because I live in Canada and I work in the US. And so I get both. But what you see is there are some very dramatic differences between what's going on in Canada and what's going on in the US. But the impact is being felt. The impact of what's going on in the US is being felt around the world. So what this chart shows you is that this is the trust across all four institutions, looking at informed public and general public. Oh, the part I forgot to mention is historically, informed public has been far more positive than the general population. And what we were seeing over the last 5 years in particular was a widening gap between how the informed public felt about things and how the general population felt about things. This year, that seems to have changed. In Canada, things were relatively stable in trust. You saw a drop in trust in NGOs, and you are starting to see a drop in trust in NGOs around the world. So what that's telling us is that all NGOs aren't created equal. Trust in business is flat in Canada. Trust in government went up slightly. And trust in media actually got a nice bump in Canada. If you compare that to the US, you had a massive drop in NGO. You had a massive drop in trust in business. You had an even more massive drop in government, the biggest that we've ever seen. And you had a massive drop in media. So trust in the U.S. just fell off a cliff. This looks at the average of trust across the 4 institutions around the 28 markets. And what you see, as laid out by the green, is basically the world is becoming a group of distrusters. And when I presented this over the years, Canada was always in the group of trusters. The last 2 years, not so much. It's gone down. And what you saw this year was the largest single drop in trust across all 4 institutions in the U.S. We've never in the 18 years had that big a drop in trust. Now, you also see a big drop in trust in Italy, and look at what's going on there. Funnily enough, the highest increase in trust is in China. Why is that? We believe it's because of economic prosperity. And people see it going in the right direction, and in particular, they see it going in the right direction compared to the US. So Chinese are becoming more proud of the direction they go in. Now, the one very odd thing about China is there is a total correlation between how government is perceived and how the press is perceived. They're seen as the same thing. So when we look at media across the globe, media is now the least trusted institution. In fairness, it's down there with government. But what this is telling us is 22 of 28 markets fall into the distruster category. You saw Canada actually came up, but you look at the US going down. And you can see the markets where trust where trust is predominant, and it's the China, Indonesia, India, United Arab Emirates. This presentation is given for the first time every year at Davos. Richard stands on the stage, and he presents, and he goes through the numbers. And when he was presenting trust 2 years ago, United Arab Emirates came out as the highest level of trust. And the guy from the United Arab Emirates jumped up and goes, "We won! We won!" in the middle of the presentation. So it added some color to it. So if that's looking at where we're at in terms of trust, what's really becoming clear is there is a big search for truth going on. And I know that's the theme of your conference this week, but it is really true. People don't know where to get their facts from. People don't know what to believe. People don't know how to process the information they're getting. And that's what we're going to look at right now. We added this question this year. We've never asked it before, so we have no historical data on it. But Canadians are worried about fake news as a weapon, not just as a thing that confuses us. They are worried that other countries can use it to knock us off our perch. 65%. Now, in the US, that's 70%. That's a scary number. And you can see the breakouts by country of how this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. So what do people define as media now? Basically, it's 2 spheres. The outer sphere you see here are platforms, social media, search, and news apps. And news apps could be anything from HuffPo to anything that is born digital. And then you have publishers. 92% of Canadians see journalists as media. That's a really good thing. But 35% of Canadians see brands as publishers. That's different. They see brands as a source of news. 20% see influencers. And if you look at the US numbers, the biggest difference is in social media. About 50% of people see social media as media. So when we looked at journalism specifically, what we saw in Canada is a really nice rebound in trust in journalists, up 10 points, and platforms didn't grow. And platforms have been stable for quite a while, but as you can see, journalism's been going up and down. So Canada got a nice bump there. When we look at traditional media, got a bigger bump than anybody. So that's great. You see online media came up a significant amount, and then the search engines and social media stay flat. Now, the weird thing in these numbers is if you ask Canadians or Americans where they go to for news, you'll see search engines rank very highly. But what they're looking for is branded news on search engines. So the numbers get a bit weird. What happens here is Canada is probably the biggest believer in traditional media in the world. Their numbers would be at the highest level. So if you compared this to the American numbers, traditional media went up 2 points, not 11 points. Now again, remember, media as a whole got hammered in the US on a trust perspective. So this is where it starts to get weird. When you look at 54% of Canadians are now saying that they look at news less than once a month, less than once a week, which we have classified as disengaged. So engaged is more than once a week, less than once a week is disengaged. So our world is splitting to half the people are disengaged. About 30% would identify themselves as consumers of media, and 16% would identify themselves as amplifiers of media. Somebody who does something with the media. They share it somehow. Again, if we were to compare this to the US, slightly less percentage are about 50% are disengaged. About 25% are consumers. And a full 10 points higher are amplifiers. And amplifiers are critically important to us because that's our way of getting disengaged people to listen, as you will see later. So this becomes quite interesting. We're getting into some tricky stuff now. So why are they becoming disengaged? They're becoming disengaged because they're becoming more and more skeptical. What's the problem with fake news? Fake news makes you believe I can't trust it. So how's that showing up? People are starting to believe more and more. 63% of Canadians believe that media is more concerned about attracting a big audience than reporting. 63% believe that you are prepared to sacrifice accuracy in order to break a story. And 54% believe that media supports an ideology versus informing the public. And again, the US numbers would be about the same on the large audiences, but higher on the breaking news and on the ideology. There's also an increasing uncertainty about real or fake news. People who agreed with the statement that I don't know what to trust, that 65% of the average person does not know how to tell good journalism from rumor or falsehood. That's pretty scary. Almost 7 in 10 can't tell if it's real. 58% is becoming harder to tell if a piece of news is produced by a respected media organization. So now they're not knowing what they can trust of the branded things they are seeing. So there's a whole bunch at work trying to discredit what journalists do. And lastly on this front, the 3 biggest trust-building mandates for media, guarding information quality, investigating corruption, and safeguarding privacy, are Only 43% of Canadians believe that news outlets or media guards information quality. That's pretty low when that's the highest thing that we're supposed to be doing. 59% believe that we effectively investigate corruption, and 36% believe that we safeguard privacy. Now, remember that this study was done end of October, early November, so this is before Cambridge Analytica. So these numbers will have gotten worse. This lack of confidence in media is undermining trust and truth. So people are projecting, I don't trust what I'm reading, into, I'm not sure what is true at 62%. I'm not sure if the government leaders are good people or bad people. And I'm not sure if I can trust business people at 44%. So numbers that are getting very high. This is cheery stuff, isn't it? So don't worry, there are some bright spots in here. I found this part interesting. 40% of Canadians believe that they are less informed than they were 10 years ago. Which you think about how much more information there is. And everybody talks about the onslaught of information we have, and yet 40% of Canadians believe that they're less informed. 34% believe that they're reading or listening to the news less than I used to, which is starting to point to avoidance. And I generally try and avoid following the news. So if you look at the American numbers, they'd be exactly the same for less informed, and they would be higher for I'm reading and listening to the news less than I used to, and I generally try to avoid following the news. You see people actively shutting down on following the news because they find it depressing. They don't know what to believe. And you hear that in conversation now. So on the positive side, social media is less believable than traditional media. And what was happening prior to this year was social media and traditional media were seen to be becoming the same thing. There was a coming together of it, and now you've got a breaking apart again. So if you're asked, which do you trust, social media or traditional? 76% of Canadians will tell you trust TV or newspapers, while only 24% trust social media. News from traditional media, 77% trust news from traditional media with only 23%. Again, the US numbers are quite different. The traditional media numbers are lower. The social media numbers are higher, about 10 points. So again, a divergence from what's going on south of the border. One of the most encouraging things is I talked earlier about one of the biggest shifts we saw 2005, 2006 with the advent of social media was people believing in peers, not in experts. This is the first time we've seen a big change in people believing more in experts. So whether it be academic expert, technical expert, financial experts, CEOs, they all went up. They all went up in the US as well. Not to the same degree, but the same phenomenon is going on there. So now I'm not so sure I'm going to trust Billy Bob. I want to know, what does an expert think? What does somebody who knows what they're talking about think, that I can believe they know what they're talking about? And you saw in both countries, a person like myself and employees go down. That doesn't mean employees aren't important. They're still very important. But they're not as trusted as they were a year ago. Again, on the positive side, 54% of Canadians say that they rely on a specific brand of newspaper, cable, or website to get their news. And 90% of that 54% trusts that. So you've got, in Canada, broadcast news show at 26%, cable news at 26%, newspapers at about 16%, News sites at 16%, and so on down the line. So if you look at it, clearly broadcast news is the most trusted source in Canada, with newspapers being second and the other media following behind. If you compare this to the US, if you add broadcast news and cable news, they're the biggest in the US. But if you separate them out, newspapers are far more influential in the US. And that would make sense when you see what's going on with the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal in the US, where you have a resurgence in subscriptions, a resurgence in popularity, not in advertising, but in readership. So how do you become a more trusted publisher of choice? Some of the things are pretty obvious. Doubling down on quality. Being more 64% say need to be more rigorous. Engage in high quality journalism. 70% say be clearer. And 66% say make it more accessible. Give it to me where I can use it, whether it be on my phone, whether it be on my iPad, whether it be in traditional media. The trick becomes, how do you prove you're doing that? How do you prove you're being more rigorous? How do you prove you're being clearer? Because you have a very vocal critic who is saying you're not doing those things, that you're obfuscating, you're trying to confuse, you're trying to lie. So being able to prove it becomes, not just do it, but prove it becomes important. We asked people what forums they wanted. People are looking for more personal experiences and less data. Again, somehow there's a fundamental difference in the US. They're looking for more data and less personal experience. Both countries, video is obviously becoming more and more important. Spontaneous speakers and being able to use people who appear to speak from the heart. One of the things that like it or not, Twitter and those sorts of forums have allowed is they believe they're getting the real thing. And when we're delivering the news, they're not as sure we're getting the real thing. If you look at the larger study, the least trusted person to talk to is the company spokesperson, by far. And then there actually is, you actually can go through and look at what is the situation and figure out who is the most trusted spokesperson to go against that situation. If you have a company crisis, it's the CEO. If you have an employee issue, if you have a Me Too problem, it's an employee. But you can literally go through and figure out who's going to be the most trusted person I could put on camera, or who's the most trusted person I could quote to be able to do it. And it never is the company spokesperson, which makes my business harder and harder. What they're looking for also is and this doesn't seem to fit with clear and simple, but they're looking for a more detailed argument as opposed to short snackable. And yet we know the whole market's going to short snackable. So this talks about amplifiers. And amplifiers in Canada about 16%, in the US about 25%. The reason amplifiers are important are they are the people who can help you with the disengaged. Because they take your news and almost qualify it for people when they share it. So, and if you ask amplifiers why they do it, most of them think they're really, really good people. And 46% of the people say they're doing it to bring about positive change in the world. 34% say they have thoughts and opinions that need to be heard. Everybody needs to hear my opinion. And 33% say, I feel a responsibility to correct the lies and information. Again, if you look at the US numbers, your top number would be the same. Thoughts and opinions that need to be heard is much higher in the US, 10 points higher. And feeling a responsibility to correct is 10 points higher as well. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody in the room. The reason it's important is 57% of those disengaged people say if they hear about it 5 times or less from different sources, if they hear about a news story 5 times or less from different sources, they're more likely to check it out, which means they're more likely to become engaged. So, how do you earn the loyalty of the disengaged, of that 50 or 46%? You got to present information in a way that's simple and easy to understand. Get the facts right. Focus on the news, not the media personality. Focus more on facts than opinion and commentary. That's becoming a big deal right now, is this notion of focusing on facts. Let me make up my mind. Don't you try and persuade me to make up my mind one way or another, because that's seen as bias now. That I can access this anywhere. Content's short and easy to absorb. Multiple sources to verify the news is reporting. You're starting to get into how do you prove it's different. So all of those, that's the state of media and the state of journalism in Canada. So what we've done is taken a huge, huge study and looked at one slice of it. It's interesting how all this stuff works together and what Canadians see as the role. So what you have here is Canadians see businesses' role as to drive economic prosperity, invest in jobs, and innovate. And increasingly, and this is important to you in this room, they're expecting business to weigh in on societal issues because they don't think things will change if business doesn't get more involved. So when you see BlackRock come out and say, we're only going to invest in these type of companies, not that type of companies, that's seen as a positive thing by people. In terms of NGOs, they see NGOs as improving the quality of life, informing good life decisions, and creating a sense of community. In terms of government, to drive economic prosperity, provide social services, safeguard privacy. And the other thing that is a very clear difference between how Canadians see Canadian government and anybody else sees their government. Canadians love regulation. So if they feel you're doing something untoward or you're not doing what you're supposed to, Canadians are thrilled to slap regulation on. And they see that as the role of government. And that would be very different than what you would expect in the US. And lastly, for media, they're expecting media to guard the information quality. They're expecting to be able to trust it. They're expecting media to investigate corruption. And you saw that number was actually quite high in the study. And they're expecting more and more to safeguard privacy. And safeguard privacy, again, remember this was before Cambridge Analytica, so that's going to have gone up. But I hope that gives you some feel for how Canadians are perceiving media, how they're perceiving it compared to other places in the world. Unfortunately, fake news is working. It is really becoming a disruptor in that it's making people not understand what to believe, and that we are going to have to come up with strategies to convince people that our work is credible and believable. And it goes as much for your work as it does for my work, anybody in the public domain. And I'd like to close with a funny, super scary video, if you don't mind.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate, because it's your long weekend. It's sort of, you've had 2 long weekends. But John is available. We're going to do some Q&A, so we'll start with some questions. Is there the Google box somewhere? I can start with asking a question, though. At the very end there, you talked about corruption, and that reporting on corruption is really important, and that's the kind of journalism people trust. But if we're so divided now, if you're reporting on corruption about the guys that you like, then are you actually going to believe that reporting? Because it comes down to people are so divided now about who they support.
Yeah, the short answer is no. You are not going to believe it if you think those people like or those people hate. The biggest thing you see in the U.S. right now are the teams. If it's on Fox News, that means it is a Trumpian point of view. And that is seen as a media channel for Trump, whether that's true or not. And if it's in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or CNN, that is seen as anti-Trump. And people look at it. It's interesting, Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the message. You see the volume of Trump stuff in the New York Times or the volume of Trump stuff on CNN. People just go, well, it must be bullshit because there's so much stuff. They've turned it into a reality TV. It's obscured everything. It's the weirdest time to be there. You go. So if I work in New York, D.C., Atlanta, L.A., San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago. And I'm there at least every 6 weeks. And if you go there as a Canadian, you might as well be from Mars, but you go there as a Canadian, and you just observe, you would say everybody hates Trump. Because you either are vocal against Trump or you don't say anything. And the don't say anything people support Trump. But they're not about to get in an argument in a work setting or a public setting, so they just don't say anything. And you think, well, you're rich, or you're this, or you're that, or you're educated, There are tons of Trump supporters, but they're not vocal. The vocal ones are the ones you read about, the trailers and all that sort of stuff. But there are tons of rich people who are Trump supporters. So it's a really weird, this divide is so big, it's not even, it appears to be out there because it's out there in the press, but it's not out there in the public, which I find very strange.
I have one more question as the head of creative and content for North America. When you look at a promo campaign that CNN's running, which is, this is an apple and it is an apple, it's not a banana, what do you think when you see something like that? Is that going to actually have an impact?
No, sorry. I'm not supposed to say things
well, I kind of asked that because I agree with you.
I'm trying to remember, is that a client? Is that no, in my opinion, that's not going to work because you're appealing to people who think that way. And the hardest thing is, how do you appeal to people who don't think that way? What is it? And that's why so much of this is going to be emotional. How do you get people to respond to the emotion of the argument? Because if it's rational, it tends just to shut down. It is really hard to have a conversation that doesn't get bad emotional, really quickly. I think that CNN stuff, to someone who's a pro-Trump supporter, would go, yeah, great, I believe that. But the disengaged or the Trump, they're going to go, take your apples and your bananas and go to the market.
Do we have any questions from the floor?
Yes, thank you.
The slide where you listed the criteria that people ascribe to trustworthiness of media.
Yep.
And the scores on which people would be, or journalists would be asked to increase it? They're saying what would engage the disengaged?
Yes.
More rigor, more clarity, more et cetera, et cetera. They were all uber rational.
Yes.
And yet you just said that people respond more emotionally to information and presentation, et cetera. So I wonder, how much do you trust people's reports of rationally responding to something when what we're seeing behaviorally is the primacy of emotional response?
Well, it's like that comment about people want more detailed analysis, and yet everything in the world tells us they want more snackable content. So I think research can provide a direction, and I think there are rational things that need to be delivered. In my opinion, they're going to need to be delivered in an emotional way, or you won't break through. And I'll give you a really weird example, but this is one that worked on me. So I was lucky enough to be a judge at Cannes. And we're going through and we're watching all these. We watched 2,300 submissions. And everybody's saving the world. Everybody blew up the internet. Everybody's wonderful and good. And I'm going through, and there was a case in Germany where the Germans were starting to turn against the government for letting in so many Syrians. So I, like you, probably I gave some money to Syrian refugees in Canada, but I didn't really think about it. I didn't understand what a Syrian refugee was. I just did it because that was a good thing to do, probably, and my wife said, do it. So I'm sitting there, and there was a case, and it was said they needed to convince Germans that letting in 1 million refugees was a good thing. So they did a study, and they said, what is the one thing that a Syrian refugee flees the country with? What do you think that would be?
Cell phone.
Cell phone, pictures, their house keys.
Oh.
Why do they bring their house keys? Because they want to go back. They're not there to steal your women and drink your booze and take your jobs. They're there because they're going to be killed in Syria. That made me understand that. I didn't understand that before. I thought they just wanted to go from their bad place to our good place. So that emotional approach, and it was called Keys of Hope, but that emotional approach made me understand. And I think that's what it's going to take to bring some of these people, but that's not going to show up in research.
We have time for one more.
Yes. You get the Google box. Whoa.
On your head.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about people being disengaged with the news, I mean, we're all here because we love the news.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, and last night I was getting ready to go see Come From Away.
Yes,
I had CNN,
great play.
Fantastic show. You have to go see it. But I had CNN on in the background, and Wolf Blitzer was talking, and I'm getting ready, and I'm hearing breaking news. Okay, I'm listening. Okay, yeah. Then 5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes later, breaking news, and more breaking news, and it just came coming and coming in these waves, and they weren't, they weren't planes hitting the towers. They weren't Kennedy being shot. They weren't Desert Storm happening. They were things that we've been following for months.
Yep.
And I just feel like, are people exhausted?
Yep.
And that's why they're disengaged in some respects? I mean, even people like me who love the news are starting to get enough.
Yep.
And so is that, are we shooting ourselves in the foot, or a CNN particularly, because they're breaking news all the time? Within 5 minutes, there were 3 breaking news stories, and none of it was, earth-shattering. So I'm just wondering if that's something that's happening.
Again, I really hope CNN isn't a client. I'm so fired if it is. They actually are. Are they? But yeah, that steady pounding of turning everything into, and as media, we do have a responsibility. We turn snowstorms into Snowmageddon. We turn hurricanes into hurricane of the century. So we do some of that. But a CNN does it 30 times a day with a new panel. And it's just constant. And there are so many. We conditioned everybody to like this stuff and get addicted to it with reality TV. We had a reality TV guy get elected as president, and all of a sudden we have the biggest reality TV show in the world. And he understands reality TV. He is not a stupid guy. Whatever you think of him, he is not a stupid guy. What did he say to Leslie Stahl the other day? That the way I'm going to get nobody to believe you is just yell at you about fake news, and then nobody trusts you. And it's true. Nobody knows who to trust. The fake news thing it's brilliant. It's scary, 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 but there has to be an antidote to it. That's what we have to figure out, so that people can go, yes, this is trusted journalism. Yes, we use 2 sources on everything. Yes, we don't try and break news before it's ready. Yes, we don't. And like in my business, in the PR business, our whole world is how do you do it faster and cheaper? No different than your world. Well, the risk of faster and cheaper is it's inaccurate. It's not, you haven't thought about what the unintended consequences are. And you can end up in a bigger mess. And we make a lot of money out of people getting in messes. So you guys help us there sometimes. But some of this stuff is just happening because we don't know how to deal in this new reality. And it really is different. I mean, that's if you take nothing else out of this study, is how much it changed this year compared to all the other years. Now, if you just look at the Canadian numbers, it doesn't look that way. But if you look at what's going on globally, there are fundamental shifts going on that are scary, and there are some positive shifts going on.
Thank you, John. That was really wonderful.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We have a coffee break coming up. And after the coffee break, we'll have our annual Bear Pit session with the news leaders from CTV, Global, and CBC. And also we'll be having Daryl Bricker will be here talking about the exclusive poll that Ipsos has just done for our conference. They did it last year, and we did a comparative for this year, so I think you'll find that interesting. And I would like to say thank you to Denton's, who is our sponsor for our coffee break. Thank you, everybody.